Betrayal usually ends in screaming matches and shattered glass, but Sarah Mitchell chose a much deadlier response: total disappearance. Upon finding undeniable proof of her husband's sordid affair, she didn't shed a single tear or wake him for a confrontation. She simply packed a black duffel bag, walked out of their multi-million-dollar Seattle estate, and vanished into the night. For an entire year, her husband and his new mistress lived like royalty, smugly believing the quiet wife had surrendered and walked away with nothing. They were about to learn a horrifying truth. A silence wasn't a retreat. It was a countdown. Sarah and Avery Mitchell were the crown jewels of Seattle's luxury real estate development scene. To the outside world, they were a perfectly synchronized machine. Avery was the charismatic face of Mitchell & Co., the man who smoothed city councilmen and charmed billionaire investors. Sarah was the architect of their success, the brilliant operational mind who managed the numbers, oversaw the contracts, and quietly ensured their empire didn't crumble under the weight of Avery's unchecked ambitions. They had been married for 8 years, having built everything from the ground up together, in a cramped, leaky apartment before finally making their millions. The betrothal didn't announce itself with a dramatic confession or a tearful breakdown. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening via an obsolete piece of technology. Avery had flown out to Denver for what he claimed was a high-stakes zoning negotiation. Sarah, battling a mild migraine, had retreated to the guest bedroom to read. She reached into the nightstand for a charging cable, and her fingers brushed against an old iPad mini device they hadn't actively used in over 2 years. The battery was completely dead, but out of sheer absent-mindedness, she plugged it in. 10 minutes later, the screen lit up. Because it was tied to Avery's primary iCloud account, a backlog of sent iMessages began to flood the lock screen. The notification chimes were relentless. Ding, ding, ding. Sarah picked up the tablet expecting spam or automated alerts. Instead, she saw a name, Skylar Harrington. Skylar was a junior interior designer they had contracted for a boutique hotel project 6 months prior. She was 26, vibrant and fiercely ambitious. Sarah had actually liked her. With a chilling detachment, Sarah unlocked the device. The password was still their anniversary date. She didn't feel the immediate suffocating crush of heartbreak. Instead, a cold, clinical numbness washed over her as she scrolled through 6 months of deceit. I can still taste you. Denver is going to be amazing, baby. Read a text from Skylar, time-stamped just 3 hours ago. Counting the minutes. The suite at the Saint. Regis is booked. Just ask for 3 days. I love you, Avery had replied. Sarah sat on the edge of the guest bed, the blue light of the screen illuminating her pale face. She didn't cry. The tear simply refused to come. She felt entirely hollowed out, as if her soul had been surgically extracted, leaving only a highly functioning, hyper-rational shell behind. She read everything. The complaints Avery made about Sarah being too focused on work and cold. The promises he made to Skylar about their future. The digital receipts for diamond earrings, luxury spa weekends, and a down payment on a sleek BMW, all paid for from a secondary bank account, Sarah knew nothing about. A lesser woman would have taken a screenshot, called a divorce lawyer, and initiated a bloody public war. But Sarah's mind worked differently. She was a strategist. She realized in that cold, silent room that Avery hadn't just broken her heart. He had stolen her life. If she confronted him now, he would use his charisma to spin the narrative, hide his assets, and drag her through years of agonizing litigation. So Sarah did the unexpected. She did nothing. She calmly placed the iPad on the kitchen island. Next to it, she placed her 3-carat diamond engagement ring and her platinum wedding band. She packed a single bag with her most essential clothing, a passport, and her personal laptop. She didn't leave a dramatic note. She didn't write, "I know. At 2 a.m., amidst a torrential Seattle downpour, Sarah Mitchell got into her car and drove away into the dark." When Avery returned from Denver 3 days later, high on the thrill of his illicit weekend, he walked into a silent house. He found the iPad. He found the rings. His initial reaction was blind, suffocating panic. He called Sarah's cell phone dozens of times, but it went straight to a disconnected line. He called her sister Rachel, who lived in Portland. Rachel coldly informed him that she had no idea where Sarah was, and even if she did, she would rather die than tell him. For the first few weeks, Avery lived in a state of paranoid terror, expecting to be served with divorce papers, expecting the company accounts to be frozen, expecting his reputation to be dragged through the mud on social media. But weeks turned into a month, and nothing happened. No lawyers called. No subpoenas arrived. The joint accounts remained untouched. Slowly, the panic morphed into relief, and the relief mutated into sheer arrogance. Avery convinced himself that Sarah had simply broken under the pressure. She had always been conflict-averse, he rationalized to his friends. She had walked away because she couldn't handle a fight. By the 3rd month, Avery moved Skylar into the master bedroom of the marital home. Skylar wasted no time erasing Sarah's ghost. She hired contractors to rip out Sarah's beloved rose garden, replacing it with a minimalist fire pit. She threw away Sarah's custom drapes and painted the house in stark, trendy grays and whites. To the outside world, Avery spun a masterful tale of a mutual quiet separation. He claimed Sarah had suffered a mental breakdown and needed space to find herself abroad. The Seattle elite, always hungry for fresh blood, easily accepted the beautiful, youthful Skylar as the new queen of Mitchell & Co. But while Avery and Skylar were busy redecorating and popping champagne on yachts, they had no idea what the phantom ex-wife was actually doing. Sarah hadn't suffered a breakdown. She was living in a sparsely furnished high-security apartment in downtown Chicago under her maiden name, Sarah Jenkins, and she was working 18-hour days. Before leaving, Sarah had quietly transferred her personal, legally protected inheritance, a sum Avery couldn't touch, into a private trust. But more importantly, before walking out the door, she had downloaded the entire back-end of Mitchell & Co.'s financial servers onto an encrypted hard drive. In Chicago, Sarah hired Arthur Pendleton, a ruthless retired forensic accountant who specialized in corporate fraud. Together, they spent the year meticulously dissecting Avery's financial life. What they found was far worse than infidelity. Avery had grown sloppy. To fund his lavish lifestyle, impress Skylar, and maintain the illusion of infinite wealth, he had been systematically embezzling from his own company. He had created dummy vendor accounts, fake landscaping firms, ghost consulting agencies, routing millions of dollars of company and investor money into offshore accounts. He was inflating project costs, defrauding his silent partners, and committing blatant tax evasion. Because Sarah had been the operational backbone, her sudden absence meant Avery had to take over the books. Without her sharp eye, his fraudulent structures became clumsy and desperate. He was bleeding the company dry, assuming his endless charm would keep the investors blind. Sarah didn't just want a divorce. A divorce would give her half of a company that Avery was driving into the ground. A divorce would allow him to play the victim. Sarah wanted total annihilation. Over the course of that year, she operated like a ghost in the machine. She anonymously leaked subtle breadcrumb hints of financial instability to Mitchell & Co.'s biggest competitors. She quietly bought up the debt of Avery's primary subcontractors through a shell corporation she established in Delaware. She gathered an airtight dossier of federal crimes, neatly packaged and ready to detonate. She watched from afar, monitoring Skylar's public Instagram account, watching the mistress flaunt stolen wealth. She watched Avery announce a massive, multi-million-dollar luxury high-rise project called the Apex, a project he absolutely did not have the liquid capital to complete. Sarah waited. She waited for them to climb to the absolute highest, most precarious peak of their false reality, because she knew that the higher they climbed, the harder the fall would be. Exactly 1 year and 2 weeks after Sarah walked out into the rain, Avery and Skylar hosted the event of the season. It was the official launch gala for the Apex project, held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. It was also unofficially their engagement party. Skylar was sporting a massive, gaudy, radiant-cut diamond on her left hand, bought with funds Avery had quietly siphoned from the project's escrow account. The ballroom was dripping with wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the city's most powerful investors, politicians, and socialites. Waiters circulated with silver trays of Dom Perignon and beluga caviar. Avery, dressed in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo, was in his element, holding court near the ice sculpture, telling a roaring crowd how bright the future of Mitchell & Co. was. Skylar clung to his arm, wearing a custom silk gown, practically glowing with the triumph of a woman who believed she had won the ultimate prize. The string quartet was playing a lively Vivaldi piece when the massive mahogany doors of the ballroom swung open. At first, nobody noticed, but as the figure walked down the grand carpeted steps, a strange, rippling hush began to fall over the crowd near the entrance. The silence spread like a contagion, cutting through the chatter and laughter until even the string quartet faltered to a messy halt. Avery, noticing the shift in the room's energy, turned around, a charismatic smile frozen on his face. The smile shattered. Standing in the center of the room, parting the sea of wealthy elites like a hot knife through butter, was Sarah. But it wasn't the Sarah that Avery remembered. The woman he knew had been exhausted, wearing conservative business suits, her hair always pulled back in a practical, stressed bun. The woman standing before him looked like a weapon. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit that screened power. Her posture was flawless, her expression utterly unreadable, her eyes dark and calculating. She looked radiant, wealthy, and dangerously calm. Skylar's hand tightened on Avery's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. "Avery," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is she doing here?" Avery couldn't speak. His throat was entirely dry. He watched in paralyzed horror as his legal wife walked directly toward him. The crowd of investors, many of whom deeply respected Sarah and had wondered about her sudden disappearance, watched with bated breath. The tension in the ballroom was so thick it was suffocating. Sarah stopped 3 feet away from them. She didn't look at Skylar. She didn't even acknowledge the mistress's existence, rendering the younger woman completely invisible. She locked eyes solely with Avery. "Sarah," Avery finally managed to choke out, trying to force a tone of gentle concern for the sake of his audience. We thought you were in Europe. Are you okay? You can't just barge in here." "Hello, Avery," Sarah interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the ballroom, it carried with crystal clarity. It was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. She didn't throw it at him. She extended it gracefully, forcing him to reach out and take it. "What is this?" Avery hissed under his breath, his eyes darting nervously to the whispering investors surrounding them. "If these are divorce papers, you could have sent them to my lawyer. You didn't have to make a scene." A tiny, razor-sharp smile played at the corner of Sarah's mouth. "Oh, Avery, you always thought so small." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him and the trembling Skylar. "Those aren't divorce papers. That is a courtesy copy of the forensic audit my team submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago. It details the $4.2 million you embezzled from the Apex investors to buy Skylar's ring, a car, and your yacht. Avery's face drained of all color, the transformation so sudden it seemed almost violent. One moment he was standing tall beneath the chandelier lights, basking in the admiration of investors and colleagues. The next, he looked like a man who had been struck clean across the chest. His lips parted, but no words came. The confident executive persona he had worn so effortlessly just minutes ago was gone, stripped away in an instant. Sarah continued, her tone smooth and measured, as though she were presenting quarterly projections rather than dismantling a man's life. As you'll see on page 3, I haven't just been resting. I am now the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings. The name hit the room like a shockwave. Vanguard Holdings. Every serious investor in that ballroom knew it. The shadow entity that had quietly, relentlessly acquired Mitchell & Cole's mounting debt over the past 6 months. The very lifeline Avery had clung to, believing it to be an anonymous benefactor keeping his empire afloat. Sarah took a small step back, straightening to her full height. There was no hesitation in her posture, no tremor in her voice. "Ha! I own your debt, Avery," she said, projecting just enough for the front rows to hear. "I own this project. And as of 9 a.m. tomorrow, I am initiating a hostile takeover of Mitchell & Co. on the grounds of gross executive misconduct." A strangled gasp escaped from Skylar, sharp and involuntary. She took a half step backward, as if distance might somehow shield her from the fallout. Avery, meanwhile, looked down at the envelope in his hands. The documents inside official, stamped, undeniable shook as his grip faltered. The world he had built, the narrative he had curated so carefully, was collapsing in real time. Not slowly, not gradually, but all at once. He opened his mouth, perhaps to argue, to deny, to reclaim control of the room. No sound came, because there was nothing left to say. Sarah didn't wait for it anyway. She had no interest in pleas or apologies. No curiosity about excuses. This was not a conversation, it was a conclusion. She had already delivered the final blow. With a calm, decisive motion, she turned on her heel. The deep crimson of her suit cut sharply through the stunned crowd, a vivid streak of authority against the pale shock on every face around her. Without looking back, she walked toward the grand staircase, each step measured, controlled, absolute. Behind her, the ballroom remained frozen. Avery and Skylar stood at its center like figures abandoned on a stage after the curtains had fallen silent, exposed and utterly alone. Around them, the investors who had once smiled and nodded now stared with dawning horror. Calculations were already forming behind their eyes. Losses, liabilities, betrayal. The man they had trusted was unraveling before them, and the woman they had overlooked had just taken everything. The silence Sarah left behind was not calm. It was the kind of silence that follows destruction, the heavy, suffocating stillness after something irreversible has occurred. For nearly 30 seconds, no one moved. The string quartet had stopped mid-piece, bows hovering awkwardly above unmoving strings. A waiter stood immobilized near the edge of the room, a silver tray of champagne glasses trembling faintly in his grip. Even the low hum of conversation that had once filled the ballroom had vanished completely. Then, like a crack spreading through glass, the whispers began. At first they were faint, disbelieving them as exchanged between neighboring guests. But within seconds they grew louder, sharper, feeding off one another until the entire room buzzed with tension. What just happened? Did she say takeover? Vanguard, she owns Vanguard. Panic crept in quickly, replacing confusion, because the implications were becoming clear. and they were catastrophic. Madeline Quinn moved before anyone else. At 70, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had built and preserved empires across decades. The matriarch of the Quinn real estate dynasty, she was not easily rattled, but she was not a woman who tolerated uncertainty, especially where her money was concerned. She had invested $30 million into the Apex project for one reason: Sarah Mitchell. Not Avery. Never Avery. Sarah's absence over the past year had been the one variable she hadn't been able to account for. Now, standing in the aftermath of this revelation, that missing piece had returned, and it had rewritten everything. Madeline approached Avery with measured, deliberate steps. He didn't notice her at first. He was still staring at the dossier in his hands, as though willing it to change, to rewrite itself into something less devastating. Avery, Espartier. Her voice cut cleanly through the noise of the room, sharp, controlled, impossible to ignore. He looked up slowly. What she saw in his eyes was not confidence, not reassurance. It was fear. Real, unfiltered fear. Madeline's expression hardened. "Tell me," she said, each word precise, "that my $30 million is secure in escrow." The question hung between them, heavy and absolute. Around them, the whispers quieted again, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Investors leaned in. Conversation stilled, every ear tuned to Avery's response, because his answer would determine everything. Avery swallowed. For the first time in years, he had no control over the narrative, and everyone in the room could see it. Avery's head snapped up. He opened his mouth, his legendary charisma fighting desperately to formulate a lie, but his vocal cords failed him. A bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. Madeline didn't need to hear him speak. The sheer naked terror in his eyes was a confession. "You absolute fool," she spat, turning her back on him. She signaled to her husband and her team of lawyers across the room. "We're leaving, and I am calling the district attorney." That was the signal. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was entirely empty, save for a few confused waiters, a weeping Schuyler, and a paralyzed Avery. The launch party for his greatest achievement had morphed into the scene of his public execution. By Monday morning, the true nightmare began. At exactly 7 a.m., Avery was violently jolted awake by the sound of furious pounding on the custom mahogany front doors of his Mercer Island estate. He stumbled downstairs in his silk robe, his head pounding from a weekend of drinking and frantic, unanswered calls to his legal team. When he opened the door, he wasn't met by a delivery driver. He was met by Special Agent Thomas Harrison of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, flanked by 6 armed agents wearing windbreakers with federal insignias. "Avery Mitchell," Agent Harrison asked, holding up a piece of paper. "We have a federal warrant to search these premises, your vehicles and all electronic devices." "Step aside." Schuyler came down the sweeping staircase, clutching her silk robe, her face pale and devoid of makeup. She screamed as agents swarmed her pristine, greyish living room, tearing through drawers, pulling books off shelves, and seizing laptops. "You can't do this! This is my house!" Schuyler shrieked, moving to block an agent from grabbing her personal MacBook. Agent Harrison turned to her, his expression entirely devoid of sympathy. "Actually, Miss Harrington, according to the SEC injunction filed at dawn today, this house was purchased using commingled corporate funds resulting from wire fraud. As of right now, every asset in this house, including the ring on your finger, is considered stolen property." "Stolen?" Schuyler gasped, whipping her head to look at Avery. "Avery, what is he talking about?" Avery couldn't look at her. He slumped against the entryway wall, watching his empire being packed away in plastic evidence bags. The raid on the house was perfectly synchronized with a raid on the Mitchell & Co. corporate offices downtown, but when the FBI arrived at the headquarters, they found the building half empty. Sarah hadn't just reported Avery. As the new majority debt holder through Vanguard Holdings, she had legally frozen the company's operational accounts. The payroll had bounced. The contractors had walked off the sites. The Apex's was nothing but a massive half-dug crater in the middle of Seattle, and the workers had locked the gates. By Wednesday, Avery's world was entirely unrecognizable. His primary defense attorney, Simon Rolfe, a man who charged $2,000 an hour, forced Avery into a grim reality check during a meeting in a cramped, fluorescent-lit conference room. "They have everything, Avery," Simon said, tossing a thick stack of printed emails onto the table. "They have the dummy of invoices. They have the IP addresses you used to authorize the offshore transfers. They even have the receipt for the BMW you bought your girlfriend, paid directly out of the Apex plumbing budget. Your estranged wife handed them a perfectly wrapped gift. Can we fight it? I can explain the transfers as loans." "I can pay the investors back," Avery pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. Simon let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Pay them back with what? Sarah's hostile takeover of Vanguard Holdings means she controls your corporate debt. The SEC froze your personal accounts. You have exactly $400 in a checking account right now. You can't even afford to pay me past tomorrow." Avery put his head in his hands, feeling the walls of a federal penitentiary closing in around him. He had spent the last year thinking Sarah was weak, pathetic, and hiding. He now realized she was a predator, and she had spent 365 days studying his every move, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. While Avery was drowning in federal charges, Skylar was experiencing a completely different brand of psychological torture. Her fairy tale had abruptly mutated into a horror movie. Her credit cards were declined at the grocery store. The sleek, black BMW she loved to flaunt on Instagram had been towed out of her driveway by federal authorities under an asset forfeiture warrant. Her wealthy, elite friends, the women who had eagerly drank her champagne on yachts just a week prior now, treated her like she had a highly contagious disease, blocking her number and deleting pictures of her from their social media feeds. The atmosphere inside the Mercer Island mansion turned highly toxic. With no money for a housekeeping staff, the massive house quickly became a messy, echoing tomb. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Skylar was sitting on the kitchen floor, furiously trying to secure a retainer for her own defense lawyer, Bradley Finch. "I don't understand, Bradley," Skylar yelled into her cell phone. "I didn't sign any of the corporate documents. I'm just an interior designer." "Skylar, listen to me carefully," Bradley's tired voice came through the speaker. "The feds don't care. You are sitting in a house paid for by fraud. You received millions of dollars in gifts paid for by fraud. They are looking at you as an accessory after the fact. If you don't give them something they can use against Avery, they are going to indict you alongside him." "Give them what?" Skylar sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "Evidence," Bradley said coldly. "Something they don't already have. Something that proves his intent. Think, Skylar. Did he keep physical records? A ledger? Passwords? If you can hand the FBI the smoking gun, I can negotiate immunity for you. If not, you're looking at 5 to 10 years in federal prison." The line went dead. Skylar sat trembling on the cold tile. 5 to 10 years. Her youth, her beauty, her life gone. She heard the heavy footsteps of Avery coming down the stairs. He looked haggard, his designer clothes wrinkled, a heavy shadow of stubble on his jaw. The charismatic, handsome mogul she had fallen in love with was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate, cornered animal. "Who were you talking to?" Avery demanded, his eyes narrowing with sudden paranoia. "My mother," Skylar lied seamlessly, a survival instinct kicking in. She watched Avery walk to the refrigerator, grab a half-empty bottle of vodka, and take a swig directly from the glass. In that moment, the last shred of her misplaced love for him evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp instinct for self-preservation. She remembered something. A few months ago, late at night, Avery had been working in his home office. He had been highly intoxicated, agitated. He had pulled a small silver thumb drive from a hidden compartment behind a fake electrical outlet in the wall. He had cut it into a standalone laptop that never connected to the Wi-Fi. He had muttered something about an insurance policy and Cayman accounts. Skylar knew with absolute certainty that this flash drive contained the master ledger, the one thing Sarah's forensic accountant hadn't been able to digitally extract because it was kept entirely offline. That night, she waited until Avery passed out in the guest bedroom, a victim of stress and cheap vodka. With her heart hammering against her ribs, Skylar crept into the home office. She took a flathead screwdriver, popped the faceplate off the fake electrical outlet, and reached inside. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of the silver thumb drive. She pulled it out, clutching it in her palm like a lifeline. She didn't call the FBI. She didn't call her lawyer. She made a much more dangerous, desperate calculation. The feds could offer her immunity, but they would still leave her penniless. She needed money to rebuild her life. She needed leverage. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Skylar Harrington walked into the sleek, high-security downtown offices of Vanguard Holdings. She bypassed the receptionist and marched directly toward the glass-walled corner office. Sarah was sitting behind a massive, polished oak desk, looking immaculately put together in a navy blue tailored dress. She was reviewing the stack of contracts. When she saw Skylar standing in the doorway, escorted by a heavily built security guard, Sarah didn't look surprised. She merely raised an eyebrow. "It's all right, Marcus," Sarah said smoothly to the guard, her eyes locked on her husband's mistress. "Let her in, but keep the door open." Skylar stepped into the office, suddenly feeling incredibly small. The power dynamic in the room was suffocating. Sarah radiated absolute control, while Skylar felt like a beggar in designer rags. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Skylar?" Sarah asked, folding her hands on the desk. "Come to return my gardening shears." "I want a deal," Skylar blurted out, her voice trembling despite her desperate attempts to sound confident. She slammed the silver thumb drive onto the pristine surface of Sarah's desk. "I know you want to completely destroy him. The feds have the wire fraud, but they don't have the master ledger for the Cayman Island accounts. He kept it offline. This drive has the account numbers, the routing codes, and the passwords to the remaining $8 million he hid from you and the investors." Sarah looked down at the silver drive, then slowly back up to Skylar. That expression remained entirely unreadable. "And what makes you think I need that?" "Because," Skylar swallowed hard, "without it, he might still be able to afford a backdoor plea deal. He might hide the money for when he gets out. You want to salt the earth. I'm handing you the salt." "And your price?" Sarah asked, her voice dangerously soft. $2 million, Skylar demanded, lifting her chin. "Wired into a clean account in my name. I give you the drive. You get the rest of his hidden money, and I disappear." Sarah sat in silence for a long, agonizing minute. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, very slowly, a chilling, triumphant smile spread across Sarah's face. She reached over, picked up the silver thumb drive, and dropped it into a heavy crystal ashtray on her desk. "You really are as stupid as Avery is," Sarah whispered. Skylar's stomach dropped. "What?" Sarah reached under her desk and pulled out a small black audio recorder, placing it next to the ashtray. The red recording light was blinking steadily. "Did you really think I didn't know about the Cayman account, Skylar?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with pity. "I set up those dummy accounts. I fed Avery the idea that he could hide money there. The accounts are completely empty. They've been empty since the day I left. Skylar took a step back, the blood draining from her face as the horrifying reality dawned on her. This drive is useless to me, Sarah continued, pointing to the blinking red light of the recorder. But what is incredibly useful is the fact that you just walked into my office and attempted to extort me for $2 million, while openly admitting you possess stolen financial data related to an active federal investigation. Sarah picked up her desk phone and dialed a 3-digit extension. Yes, Agent Harrison, Sarah spoke clearly into the receiver, never breaking eye contact with the trembling mistress. She's here, and she brought the drive. You can send your officers up now. Skylar's knees buckled. She had tried to outplay the Grand Master, and she had just walked straight into the final trap. The arrest of Skylar Harrington inside the pristine glass-walled lobby of Vanguard Holdings was not merely a tactical victory for Sarah. It was a flawlessly executed psychological decapitation. When Special Agent Thomas Harrison escorted Skylar out of the building, the younger woman was practically catatonic. The cold, heavy click of the federal handcuffs ratcheting around her slender wrists echoed loudly off the marble floors, a stark contrast to the clinking champagne flutes she had grown accustomed to. She was walked past a dozen of Sarah's newly acquired executives, her mascara running in dark, jagged rivers down her pale cheeks, clutching her seized designer handbag like a dying woman holding a life preserver. That afternoon, Avery Mitchell was sitting in a windowless, heavily soundproofed interrogation room at the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner. When the heavy steel door finally opened, his primary defense attorney, Simon Roth, walked in. Simon was a man who usually commanded a room with ease, charging upwards of $2,000 an hour to make white-collar problems disappear. Today, however, Simon looked violently exhausted. He dropped a thick, leather-bound briefcase onto the metal table with a dull thud. "They have her, Avery," Simon stated, his voice completely devoid of its usual aggressive confidence. He didn't bother sitting down. He just rubbed his temples, visibly regretting the moment he had agreed to take on a client whose assets were completely frozen by SEC injunctions. Avery's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in terror. "Have who? Skylar? On what charges? She doesn't know anything about the corporate accounts, Simon. She's just an interior designer. She doesn't need to know the books, Avery," Simon barked, his professional veneer finally cracking. He unplastered his briefcase and threw a transcript file onto the table. "Skylar walked right into Sarah's private office this morning trying to sell a stolen flash drive for $2 million. Sarah recorded the entire interaction on a hidden device. "The FBI now has your girlfriend on tape, explicitly admitting to possessing physical evidence of a federal crime, attempting extortion, and conspiracy to conceal stolen assets." She broke within 20 minutes of federal questioning. Avery stared at the manila folder on the table as if it were a live grenade. His breathing became shallow, rapid, and erratic. "So, what did she give them?" "I never showed her the ledgers. She gave them the intent," Simon said grimly, leaning over the table, forcing Avery to look him in the eye. "She told them about the offline thumb drive. She told them about your drunken, paranoid rants regarding the Cayman Island accounts. But far worse, Avery, she handed over her unlocked iPhone to secure a plea deal. The FBI now has over 4,000 text messages where you explicitly detail using diverted project funds to pay for your Denver getaways, her diamond ring, and the yacht. You told her everything in writing. They don't just have evidence of financial mismanagement anymore. They have a paper trail proving you deliberately, maliciously, and knowingly defrauded your investors to fund an illicit lifestyle. Avery's carefully manicured, invincible image completely and utterly dissolved. He buried his face in his trembling hands, weeping openly, the harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the absolute ruin of his life. The man who had effortlessly charmed Seattle's most ruthless billionaires was now nothing more than a terrified, cornered thief, facing the crushing weight of the United States Department of Justice. Over the next 6 months, the trial of the United States v. Avery Mitchell mutated into the most sensational white-collar crime spectacle the Pacific Northwest had seen in a decade. The local media was absolutely ravenous. Jonathan Hayes, a senior investigative reporter for the Seattle Times, published weekly leaks detailing the sheer audacity of Avery's embezzlement. The courthouse was a daily circus of flashing cameras, furious former investors, and disgraced subcontractors demanding their stolen wages. Lead prosecutor Evelyn Shaw, a terrifyingly sharp woman who had never lost a federal fraud case, systematically dismantled every desperate defense Simon Roth attempted to mount. She brought in forensic accountants who mapped out Avery's dummy vendors on massive, undeniable projection screens. She called them managers of offshore banks. She presented the paper trail of the stolen BMW. But the most devastating, earth-shattering moment of the trial didn't come from the financial experts or the weeping mistress. It came on the 8th day when the prosecution called their star witness to the stand. When Sarah's name was called by the bailiff, a heavy, reverent hush fell over the packed gallery. She walked down the center aisle wearing a pristine, sharply tailored charcoal suit. Her posture was flawless. She swore on the Bible with a perfectly steady, unwavering hand. Sitting in the witness box, looking down at the courtroom, she did not look like a scorned, victimized wife. She looked like a judge preparing to pass a death sentence. For 3 agonizing hours, Prosecutor Shaw walked Sarah through the intricate operational structure of Mitchell & Co. Sarah calmly, clinically, and with devastating precision, explained how she had exclusively managed the logistics, payroll, and contracts, while Avery maintained total, unilateral control over the final escrow disbursements and executive accounts. Then it was Simon Ruff's turn for cross-examination. He was desperate, attempting a blind Hail Mary strategy to paint Sarah as a vengeful, hysterical woman who had framed her husband out of pure spite. "Mrs. Mitchell," Simon sneered, pacing aggressively before the jury box, trying to rattle her. "You expect this court to believe that you, the self-proclaimed operational mastermind of this massive company, had absolutely no idea that over $4 million was missing from the Apex project? Isn't it true that you orchestrated this entire financial collapse out of pure vindictive jealousy when you discovered my client's affair?" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She adjusted the microphone slightly, her dark eyes locking directly onto Avery, who physically shrank in his chair, unable to meet her gaze. "Mr. Roth," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the heavy mahogany walls, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. "I did not orchestrate the collapse of Mitchell & Co. I simply stopped holding it up." The courtroom was dead silent. Every juror was leaning forward. For 8 years, I worked 16-hour days to ensure every permit was filed, every contractor was vetted, and every legal loophole was flawlessly managed so my husband could play the visionary, Sarah continued, her tone unyielding. "When I discovered that he was not only unfaithful, but actively stealing from the very people who trusted us with their livelihoods, I did not frame him. I merely walked away, took my protective infrastructure with me, and allowed his own sheer incompetence to catch up with him." She paused, letting the absolute finality of her words ring out. "Avery Mitchell didn't need me to frame him. He needed me to survive. And the precise moment I removed my protection, his empire collapsed under the weight of his own greed. Simon Roth opened his mouth to object, to push back, but he had nothing. He had walked right into a buzzsaw. He quietly muttered, 'No further questions,' and returned to his seat, a defeated man. In a final, pathetic act of self-preservation before the closing arguments, Avery took the stand against his lawyer's advice. He tried to throw Schuyler under the bus, weeping as he claimed the young designer had emotionally manipulated him, demanding lavish gifts and threatening to expose their affair to the press if he didn't steal the money to keep her happy. It was a transparent, cowardly lie that only further disgusted the jury. When the verdict was read by the foreman 4 days later, the tension in the room snapped like a dry twig. Guilty on 4 counts of first-degree wire fraud. Guilty on 2 counts of money laundering. Guilty of federal tax evasion. The Honorable William Barrett looked down at Avery with unfiltered contempt. "Mr. Mitchell, your actions demonstrate a breathtaking level of arrogance and a complete disregard for the lives you have ruined. You are a predator in a tailored suit." As the heavy-set bailiff approached the defense table with a fresh set of steel handcuffs, Avery finally turned and looked back into the crowded gallery. He frantically searched the sea of furious faces, looking for any shred of sympathy, any sign of the privileged life he used to dominate. He found Sarah sitting perfectly still in the back row. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat. She simply gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod, the quiet acknowledgement of a grandmaster delivering a flawless checkmate before she stood up, smoothed her tailored coat, and walked out of the courtroom, leaving him completely to the darkness he had so meticulously built for himself. 3 years later, the heavy reinforced steel doors of the Federal Correctional Institution in Sheridan, Oregon, slid open with a deafening metallic clank that reverberated through the concrete block. Avery Mitchell, now officially designated as Inmate 849204, stepped out into the recreation yard for his mandated hour of sunlight. He looked completely unrecognizable. The sharp, vibrant 40-year-old mogul who used to grace the covers of Pacific Northwest business magazines had aged a decade in 36 months. His hair had thinned and turned a brittle, ashen gray. His posture, once commanding and arrogant, was permanently slumped under the invisible, crushing weight of an 84-month federal sentence. There were no Tom Ford suits in Sheridan. There were only stiff, ill-fitting khaki uniforms that smelled faintly of industrial bleach and desperation. Avery's current job, a far cry from managing a $500 million real estate portfolio, was working in the prison laundry facility, feeding soiled bedsheets into massive, scalding hot commercial pressing machines for 12 cents an hour. He walked slowly to the towering chain-link fence topped with razor wire, gripping the cold metal diamonds as he stared out at the distant, overcast horizon. He was entirely alone. The legendary, silver-tongued charisma that had once charmed city councilmen and secured millions in blind investments was utterly useless here. In federal prison, nobody cared about your pitch. Nobody cared about your vision. They only cared about what you could smuggle in, and Avery had nothing left to offer. 200 miles north in a damp, perpetually mold-scented studio apartment in Tacoma, Washington, Schuyler Harrington was living her own bespoke version of hell. To avoid the same cell block as the women she used to sneer at, Schuyler had accepted a brutal, unforgiving plea deal. She had surrendered every single asset she possessed to the federal government. Her designer wardrobe, her jewelry, her car, everything was seized and auctioned off to pay back a fraction of what Avery had stolen. But the true nightmare was the restitution order. She was legally bound to repay over $600,000 in illicit gifts. The radiant, fiercely ambitious 26-year-old interior designer was dead, replaced by a chronically exhausted, deeply bitter ghost. Schuyler now worked the graveyard shift at the cramped, fluorescent-lit call center for a budget airline. She spent 8 hours a night wearing a cheap plastic headset, being screamed at by angry tourists whose flights had been delayed. Every other Friday she received her meager paycheck, only to watch 80% of it immediately vanish, garnished by the IRS before she could even touch it. She lived on discounted ramen noodles and instant coffee. Her wealthy, elite friends, the women who had eagerly drank her stolen champagne on chartered yachts just a few years prior, had scrubbed her from their lives like a stubborn stain. Just last week, Scarla had been standing in the checkout line of a discount grocery store, a basket holding generic bread and bruised apples. She had looked up to see Victoria Kensington, a prominent Seattle socialite whose house Skylar had once helped decorate. Skylar had instinctively offered a fragile, desperate smile. Victoria had looked directly at her, her eyes scanning Skylar's faded polyester uniform and tired, unmanicured hands. Victoria hadn't smiled back. She hadn't even frowned. She had simply looked right through Skylar, as if she were completely invisible, and turned back to her phone. In that devastating moment, Skylar realized the prison might have actually been kinder. In prison, you were at least acknowledged. Out here, she was a pariah, condemned to a lifetime of invisible, grinding poverty. But it was the news of Sarah that truly haunted both of their waking hours. In the immediate chaotic aftermath of Avery's conviction, the city's financial district had braced for the total liquidation of Mitchell & Co. Everyone assumed the company was a toxic, radioactive asset, destined to be carved up by bankruptcy courts and sold for scrap. It was to be a cautionary tale of hubris, lust, and catastrophic fraud. They had all deeply underestimated the sheer, terrifying operational genius of Sarah Jenkins. Having legally dropped the Mitchell surname, the absolute second the divorce decree was stamped by the judge, Sarah did not take her millions and retire to a private island. Instead, she used her absolute control of Vanguard Holdings to execute a masterful, cutthroat corporate restructuring that is now taught in business ethics classes at the University of Washington. She bought the frozen, toxic assets of her ex-husband's company for absolute pennies on the dollar at a closed federal auction. Then she personally called a private meeting with Madeleine Quinn and the other defrauded investors. Sarah hadn't walked into that boardroom asking for forgiveness. She had walked in projecting pure, unfiltered competence. She laid out a staggering, mathematically flawless recovery plan. She showed them exactly where Avery had bled them dry and exactly how she was going to use Vanguard's liquid capital to restart the stalled projects. Avery was a salesman who sold you a dream, Sarah had told the room of furious billionaires, her voice remarkably steady. I am the architect who actually built the foundation. He is gone. The rot has been cut out. Now, we finish the job. Because they knew Sarah had always been the true brains behind the operation, the silent engine that had kept the machine running for 8 years. They agreed. Back in the grim cinderblock recreation room of FCI Sheridan, Avery sat on a cracked plastic chair, watching a small television mounted heavily behind a sheet of protective plexiglass. The local Seattle news was playing on mute. The camera panned up a magnificent, gleaming skyscraper of dark, polarized glass and brutalist steel piercing the cloudy Seattle skyline. It was beautiful, ruthlessly modern, and undeniably triumphant. It was the finished product of what was once a massive, muddy, bankrupt crater in the center of the city. It was the project Avery had stolen millions to fund, the project that was supposed to make him a billionaire. The news anchor cut to live footage of the grand ribbon-cutting ceremony. There, standing at the mahogany podium, looking more powerful, untouchable, and radiant than she ever had a single day during their marriage, was Sarah. She was wearing a stunning tailored emerald green coat, shaking hands with the mayor of Seattle and the governor. She wasn't standing in anyone's shadow. She was the absolute center of gravity. Behind her, massive, bold platinum letters gleamed above the main entrance of the newly completed luxury high-rise. It wasn't called the Apex. Sarah had permanently erased his legacy. She had renamed the building the Vanguard. Avery pressed his forehead against the cold chain-link fence of the prison yard, a singular bitter tear tracking down his weathered cheek. As he stared at the woman he had so foolishly discarded, he finally realized the most painful, soul-crushing truth of all. Sarah hadn't just destroyed him to get revenge. Revenge was too small a word for what she had accomplished. She had destroyed him simply to clear away the dead weight. Avery had spent his entire life thinking he was the undisputed king of his empire, but he was only ever the loud, distracting jester entertaining the court. The true queen had been quietly managing the castle the entire time. When Sarah Mitchell found the undeniable proof of her husband's infidelity, she didn't scream. She didn't throw plates. She didn't cry, because she knew that a woman who yells is a woman who has lost control of the situation. A woman who remains perfectly silent is a woman making a plan, and her plan was absolutely flawless. What a satisfying masterclass lesson in absolutely devastating karma. Sarah proved that sometimes the most dangerous reaction to betrayal isn't a screaming match or a messy public fight. It's a silent, calculated exit that sets the stage for total destruction. Avery and Skylar thought they got away with the ultimate betrayal, but they had absolutely no idea they were just pawns on Sarah's chessboard. Did you think Sarah's revenge was justified, or did she take it too far by completely ruining his entire corporate empire? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of brilliant, ice-cold justice, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. Share this video with a friend who loves a good karma story. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another dramatic, true-life tale. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.